Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen. Today I'm going to do a recipe that I've never made before, but I've eaten it so many times. This is something that, out of milk, but I've almost got enough. I need 2 cups of milk, and I've got a cup and 7/8, and I don't have another bag of milk. I've got a little bit of whipping cream. There we go, enough liquid. Enough liquid. That's how I roll. So, this is something that my mom made all the time when I was a little kid, but we would only eat it at the end of summer and only at the cottage. And let me explain that. We were a family that in the fall, usually around the time that school started, in the fall we would buy a side of beef and put it in the freezer and then eat that beef over the course of the year. Much more reasonable way to buy it. If you buy half the cow, you get a discount. That's the way it works. So we would do that, and by the middle of August, we'd be down to the last little bit of beef in the freezer. We'd be at the cottage. It would be the tough cuts. It would be the cuts that were, more than a little freezer burnt. And my mom made this because you could put any tough cut of beef in the pot and you'd get something really flavorful and beautiful out the other side. And this is a tough one for me because about a month ago I decided I was going to make it and I'd do it on the show. And I started doing research to try to figure out where this recipe came from. Where did my mother get this recipe? And I realized that elements of this are Italian, but elements of it are French or very French. And I can only assume that my mother picked it up from a family that lived really close to us at the cottage. They were Italian. So we're going to be doing like a Roman Durum Semolina Gnocchi, which is what's going on in this pot. I've got milk, and I took an onion, and I sort of severed the onion at the bottom, or at the top actually, and I've put it into the milk. I'm going to bring the milk up to a simmer, and I'm going to let the milk simmer a little bit and pull the flavor out of the onion. But the beef portion of it, it may have started out as an Italian dish, which is made with red wine, beef, and pepper. But of course, my mother did it her own way, and it became beef, white wine, or beer, and pepper with tomato, onion, and hot pepper. So I'm going to do it my mother's way, which is much more French than Italian. But it sort of brings you to this point where you realize that a lot of cuisines are very, very similar. They just have very small regional differences based on differences in taste or differences in what ingredients were available in that smaller geographic region. Okay, so lid on this pot, and we'll let that onion and milk come together. This Dutch oven, I'm going to hit a generous amount of oil and use whatever oil you like. Now, I know people are probably already typing in the comment section that you can't cook beef with white wine. Who's cooking beef with white wine? The French. Very, very simply put, the French. A lot of French recipes, especially from the 16 and 1700s, cooked beef, braised beef in white wine. And so this here is a French cookbook from the 1700s. And if you look through the beef section, pretty much to a T, every beef recipe that uses wine as a liquid, it's white wine. And if it isn't white wine, they're using something called verjus, which is this stuff. And as you can see, it is white or clear, even though this is made with Pinot Noir, which is a red grape. Verjus is made from grapes that haven't ripened yet. So they haven't ripened, they haven't got sweet yet, the sugar hasn't developed in the grape. They're crushed, the juice is extracted, and so the juice doesn't have a very high sugar content, but it has a high acid content. So this is pretty sour, pretty acidic, works fantastic for cooking this type of dish. And if I thought that this was readily available to a lot of people, I would be using it today. But I know that verjus is sometimes very difficult to get a hold of. You have to know which wineries are making and bottling it, and you pretty much have to go to that winery to get it. It's not something, at least here where I live, it's not something that is readily available. So I'm going to use white wine. And like I said, my mom often used beer. Never red wine. It was either white wine or beer, and the beer she would use would be a Labatt 50. So not an expensive beer, not a very great tasting beer at all, but that's what she used. So in goes all the beef. And I'm not worried about crowding the pot at all. Did a recipe a while back for beef bourguignon, and it was a recipe that I got out of a book written by Paul Bocuse. Paul Bocuse is an amazing, or was an amazing chef, probably the previous generation's greatest chef. And for him, when you put beef in a pot, you put in enough oil, you got the pot hot enough, you put in all the beef, and you just let her rip. No worries about overcrowding. Now I'm not touching that beef, I'm just letting it go. I really want it to build up some brown on the bottom before I start turning it and messing with the pot. Okay, let's give that its first toss. Okay, so that's been frying on the stovetop here for about 15 minutes at this point, and it has got some incredible, gorgeous browning going on there. And I had that on the highest heat. I was very attentive. I watched it very closely. Don't walk away from an operation like this. You want to make sure that you keep an eye on it. There's a difference between browning and burnt. There's a difference between caramelized and burnt. So I've got some tomato paste. Not strictly something that you would find in the French cookbooks at all, but my mother put tomato in everything, so this is just the way I remember eating it. So I'm going to stir that in and let it fry a little bit. Again, just to caramelize the tomato. Caramelizing it just brings out a little bit more flavor. I've got shallots. We grew onions that were very close to shallots growing up at the cottage, at the garden at the cottage. So I'm going to use the same type of onion, and I've just got a handful of those. I've just peeled them. I haven't chopped anything. I haven't chopped them up at all. They're just peeled. Those go in. And I've got a bit of a hot pepper that was left over from pizza night a few nights ago. That's going to go in. My mom always put something like that in just to give it a little bit of spiciness. Not spicy, just a little bit of spiciness. I've got some salt. That goes in. I can really smell that tomato now. Oh, I can smell that tomato. Okay. I'm going to move quickly. So I've got some cracked black pepper, and this is a very coarse grind. It's not really ground, it is cracked. And I'm going to put in about a tablespoon at this point, and then the wine. And at the same time I'm pouring in the wine, just scrape up the fond on the bottom of the pot. Okay, so about 3/4 of that bottle of wine, and just glug it in there. I'm going to hold back a little bit. So I'm just going to stir that in. I'm going to lower the temperature. I don't want it to boil too much right now. This is going to go into the oven. So if you are someone who is one of those people that ask me all the time, what can you use instead of wine in your cooking? Verjus is the answer. Really, Verjus is one of the answers. Because Verjus is not fermented, so there's no alcohol. So it brings everything that you want from wine in cooking without the alcohol, which I think is, for a lot of people, important. Now, just because I've got this going here, it smells great. So I've infused the milk with that onion. Waste not, want not. That onion now goes into this pot. The lid goes on this pot, and this pot goes in the oven. The oven is preheated to 275, anywhere between 275 and 325. I'm going to put that in for about an hour, hour and a half. At that point, I'm going to look inside, take a look, see if it needs any liquid. I know for my oven and this pot, I've got a really good tight-fitting lid. I'm not going to lose too much moisture, but you want to check it every once in a while to make sure that you haven't lost too much moisture, that it hasn't gone dry. If it does start to go dry, add the remaining wine. If you've added all of the wine and it's still going dry, add a little bit of water or a little bit of chicken stock or beef stock. It'll be fine. just don't let it go dry. Okay, now we're going to come back and we're going to work on the Durham Semolina Gnocchi. This is a Roman dish, which is why I think my mom got this, this whole idea from an Italian family down the way, because it certainly didn't come from her mother or any other place that I can think of. So I've got the milk in here. It's hot. The milk is hot. I'm going to add a little bit of salt. I've got Durham Semolina, which is a rough ground flour from Durham wheat. Same stuff I made pasta with. If you go back on the channel, I made a dried pasta with this. It smells like flour. And the idea is that you just stir it into the hot milk a little bit at a time, and you try to keep it from clumping. Now, I've got about a cup of milk in here. I've got about 2 cups of Durham Semolina, and I'm just going to pour it in until I reach a consistency that I like. And that changes every time you make it. So you don't think of this as an exact quantity recipe in this regard. It really is sort of a method where you look at it and you go, that's enough. And the heat is still on for the milk. We're on fairly low. I might turn it up just a touch just to keep the heat coming. Now that I'm stirring and watching. A whisk at this early stage works, but you're going to get to a point where a whisk just isn't going to work. Okay, I'm going to say that's good. Now the heat is still on. I'm going to turn that right back to the lowest setting. I've got an egg, but I only want the yolk. So we'll separate this egg. And in goes the yolk. And we just vigorously stir that in. Continuing with the heat at this point, keep it cooking. You want to cook the semolina most of the way at this point. Like 95% of the way at this point. And you're not really going to know when it's done enough. You're just going to kind of look at it and go, I'm done stirring it. I think we're ready to go. So I've reached that point. I'm done stirring it. I'm ready to go. I've got a glass baking dish here, but it could be anything. It could be a quarter sheet pan. It could just be a cookie sheet. Okay, I'm just going to smooth this out into the dish. Doesn't have to be crazy smooth. You can put some water on your spatula and get really fancy and make sure that it's perfectly smooth. Okay, so I'm just going to stick this in the fridge and let it set up. I'm going to keep my eye on the braising that's going on in the oven, but pretty much good to go until it's almost time to serve supper. Okay, so I've got the semolina out and I've cut it into little squares. Next thing I want to do is fry it on both sides, add a little bit of color to it, and finish the cooking. So I've got a heavy cast iron frying pan here. I'm going to hit it with some oil. And this is also the point where, 20 minutes before service, my mom would be prepping some veg to go either beside or in what's happening in the oven. And it would often be broccoli, cauliflower, beans, whatever was coming off of our garden when she was cooking. And so she'd put that into the Dutch oven in the last 10 minutes just to sort of get a little bit of, just to soften them a little bit, cook them a little bit, but they would still be crunchy when you ate them. Or you could just steam them on, put them on the side. It's up to you. Putting them in now makes it into more of a stew. Having them on the side makes it into something that's a little bit different. Okay, into the oil, and we give that a little bit of a fry. And we'll just flip those over. Get nice and brown. Oh, it's wonderful. And yes, I'm using a fish slice. For a lot of things, I think the fish slice is the perfect spatula. Now, the first round of gnocchi is pretty much fried up nicely. We'll get the stewed beef out of the oven. And get the lid off and take a look at that. There we go, look at that. Give that a bit of a stir. Now, if you want the sauce thicker, we could thicken that with beurre manier. Now, we've gone over beurre manier in the past. It's equal parts flour and butter mashed together, beurre manier, mashed together, and then you mix it in. And you put it on a little bit of heat on the stovetop when you mix it in. The flour cooks in seconds. There is no raw flour taste. It's in these cookbooks. This is a French cookbook from the 1700s, and pretty much every stew recipe in this book uses beurre manier. It's perfect for this type of use. So the gnocchi is done. It's got some nice color, so we'll plate that up. Put 3 on here. Okay, and we'll get some of this braised beef on top. Hey, Jules.
Hey, Glenn. Hey, friends.
And that...
Fork? Spoon? That could almost be a fork.
Maybe a fork, maybe a spoon.
Okay, a little each, just in case.
And that onion that I put in that was in the pot of milk completely disintegrated. Like, completely disintegrated.
Ah, so you've brought back the gnocchi.
Yeah, finally. I think I finally got it.
That's great.
Yes. So look at that.
That looks great.
I'm going to go with fork, I think.
Yeah, me too. I don't know what to try first, like, 'cause the stew's really good, but I'm fascinated by the gnocchi. I want to just try it on its own.
The meat. Fall apart tender. Meat and gnocchi. Oh, it's really good.
That childhood memory is perfect.
Yes. Peppery, beefy, oniony, a little bit of heat from the hot pepper. The gnocchi, which is really kind of weird because, you know, we were a mashed potato family. But somehow at the cottage, this is what we ate.
So what's fascinating though is that the gnocchi, like mashed potatoes, it's kind of a fairly, you know, it's a fairly bland flavored thing that takes on whatever you're eating with it.
It's there for everything else. It's definitely there for everything else. Now, this is a stew. At the very beginning, you could have put in all kinds of root vegetables, right? You could have put in carrots and parsnips and turnip and potatoes and everything else and come up with an amazing stew that would stand on its own, that didn't need this treatment. And that's how all of these foods are really kind of interrelated. And you can't really, don't think too hard about it. Don't think too hard about it.
And the gnocchi could be a base for almost any type of stew-like thing that you might eat.
Yes.
A chili.
Yeah.
You know.
Just a red sauce. You
Yeah.
could put any sort of red meat sauce on that, and it would be really good.
Might have another piece.
So, I think what this dish was for us was that end of the season, use up the things that we had, use up the things that really couldn't be cooked any other way because the freezer beef was getting a little freezer burnt by August because it had been there since September. Use up the last of the garden vegetables because, you know, you're starting to get into fall and the garden vegetables aren't. And I think that ethos stands today. Use what you've got, use what you can afford, and you can make a really good meal. And you don't need to use the white wine. You could use a red wine. You could use a verjus. You could just use beef stock. A little bit of vinegar.
What do you got?
Beef stock and a little bit of vinegar. And you could achieve pretty much exactly the same thing. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.